Metaxas Show. It's the show that Mark Twain once called smarter'n a blue jay what can talk possum and faster'n a naked fat man riding a bolt of lightning. So here's your plain-spoken homespun host, Eric Metaxas.
Thank you, Todd. Folks, it's Miracle Monday on the Eric Metaxas Show. Even if you're not listening to this on Monday, this is a Miracle Monday because it's Monday for us, and so whatever. I have the privilege of sitting here in the studio, the TBN studios. You like the studio?
I do like it, yeah.
With my friend Ken Fish. Ken, tons of people have listened to this program and emailed us about how thrilled they are whenever we have you on. So whenever you're in New York, I try to get you on. But now we're in the studio. There are going to be people who are going to be able to watch this on TV, perhaps on TBN, perhaps on YouTube. I don't know, but they're going to be able to watch us.
Who knows where it's going to go.
So you should have shaved. I tried to warn you.
I know it.
Now let me ask you a really personal question.
All right.
Fish, where does that come from?
My father.
Your father?
Yeah.
You're from an old line of fish?
A big tank of them, actually.
Now, when people say your family, you're all going to be there, did they say all the fish are going to be there or all the fishes are going to be there?
My family, they say all the fishes.
And when you are in Germany, do they call you Herr Fish?
Yes.
And when you're in Greece, do they call you Kyrie Psarakis?
No.
We're friends, so I got to tease you.
Pero en Mexico,
yeah.
decimos señor pescado.
Is that true?
Sí.
Señor Pescado, sí. Como no. Okay. You have a ministry in healing, in deliverance, in prophetic. A lot of people who listen to this program know about that, and a lot of people don't. And so we're going to talk to both of them, right? So I always want to ask you kind of, where have you been lately? You've been doing some ministry here in New York very recently. Some of my friends have been there. My wife Suzanne was there to witness this. But you travel around the world. What should we talk about today?
Well, we could talk about the last time I was here in November.
Yeah.
So that was only, just over 2 months ago.
Right.
You know, we actually had a very, very unusual meeting. It was a smaller meeting, and that was by design. It was intended that the people who came would be able to observe closely and basically verify to their own satisfaction that this wasn't something being done up on a stage. And
see, that's the problem with what you do, is that there's such skepticism, even in my own family. I mean, there are people that they're fundamentally hostile to it because of what they've seen in the media. And so it's frustrating because even when you see the real thing, you've seen so many versions of the fake thing or so much news about phonies.
You mean fake news?
Fake news, yeah. Yeah. Although in this case, not specifically CNN. I'm talking general fake news, yeah.
It's just a wordplay.
Yes, thank you.
But anyway, so we had this meeting in New York, and it was in November, and during the lunch break,
right,
a couple of the guys that were in the meeting went down on the street to get something to eat, and they ran into a man who was homeless and was living at one of the local rescue shelters here in the city.
Right.
And he had a problem with his one leg in that it was about 6 inches shorter than the other. And he'd had a very bad fall, which additionally created problems with his knees. So they prayed for him, and he got touched by the Lord and was significantly better. Then they brought him up into the meeting after lunch.
And by the way, what borough?
It was right here in Manhattan.
This was in Manhattan?
Yeah.
Downtown?
Yeah. It was one of these temporary officing places that has kind of a large open space that had been rented. And I can't remember now. I wanted to say it was maybe on 35th Street. But if I'm
it
off
doesn't
on
matter.
that,
I'm just kind of getting a general sense.
But anyway, so, but it was in Midtown. And we, because this was a smaller meeting, we talked to this guy, and then we prayed for him. And he got up and started walking, and his leg grew out further. And he started walking with no pain for the first time, he said, in a number of years.
Okay, now you understand there are people listening. They're saying, you're telling me the dude's leg grew out spontaneously, miraculously. You understand how that sounds to someone who has never seen anything like this.
I totally get it.
I believe it, but I've never seen anything like this because it sounds like sheer lunacy. Yeah. But you've seen it many times.
Yes.
And I've also heard many people in the healing world, the McNutts and on and on and on, all these people have been doing this forever, and John Wimber, who you were his protege. I mean, they talk about leg lengthening. Like, what is it about that? You know, it sounds like this quirky thing. What is it about people's legs being too short that this is a thing?
Well, there's a couple of angles to that. So the first angle is simply that sometimes people's backs or hips are misaligned, and therefore the overall, I'll say the geometry of the body is out of whack, and it causes one leg to be shorter than the other.
Right.
I mean, if you literally laid the legs down side by side, in this first case I'm describing, you may not have two legs that are different length, but they appear to be because of the tilting and twisting that's going on within the overall skeleton.
Okay.
The second case is the one where maybe bone has been removed, or when the leg was growing during childhood, somehow the one leg didn't develop all the calcium it should have.
Right.
And if you laid the legs down side by side, absent all the skeletal issues, still that leg would be shorter.
Okay.
So those are two different cases, and they're different kinds of healings. In the first case, what you tend to see is rotation of spine and hips, and people who have been locked up in that, whatever it is, that comes free.
Right.
And now everything is aligned properly. In the second case, bone that's been missing appears to be growing, which I understand medically people say this is impossible. It can't happen. But it does happen when it's happening.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen every time. But when it happens, that's what's going on. And so you'll see, in either case, you'll see the leg lengthen. But then, again, the deeper question, that's why I made the trouble of discriminating between these two cases, is which of the two things is really going on that causes that leg to lengthen?
I want to talk about, we don't have to talk about it for a long time, but part of the frustration with healing ministry for people who don't believe in it and for people like me who believe in it is the lack of documentation. In other words, you think, my goodness, if someone's leg grew 5 inches, surely an x-ray and a doctor ought to be able to corroborate that somehow. And I know there is some of that, but you have told me so many amazing stories, and if a tenth of them are true and could be documented, it's the craziest thing in the world,
Right.
But you, I know, are moving so fast from thing to thing. You're worried about the people. You're not worried about proving it. But I would just like to think that someone would follow you with a camera or a doctor or something, because if this is real, and I think it is, it's too important for the world not to know about.
Well, in fact, we're working on that. Somebody's given me a nice production camera. It's hard to move those around when you travel.
Yeah.
It's more baggage, it's more expense, it's more trouble. We're working on solving that problem. We could use iPhones and things like that, but people tend to look at that a little bit dubiously.
Yeah.
But beyond just the photo documentation problem, you had someone on the show not long ago, Dr. Joseph, is it Bergeron? Is that the right way to say the name? Yeah. So he got in touch with me after the show with you,
Right.
because you put us in touch.
Oh, yeah. He was talking about wanting to do this, and I flipped out. I said, you've got to talk to Ken Fish, because he needs... I mean, look, he's not just a doctor. He's a genius scientist doctor. And I think you need somebody like that, because we're at a point in the culture where there's so many people who I think are open if it's true.
Right.
But we live in a media culture that says it couldn't possibly be true. Well, the fact of the matter is I know that it is true. It doesn't mean that there aren't charlatans out there or exaggerations. But even if you don't care about God, or the fact is that if somebody says, I'll give you a pill and it'll help you, you're interested in that pill. You don't care if it came from a rhino's horn or if it's off market or whatever. People are looking for help.
That's right.
And I'm convinced that you offer real help. We would say, of course, that it's not you, that it's Jesus, that it's God, that God is still in the business of healing today. Many Christians are skeptical about that. I want to help convince them not to be so skeptical. So it's complicated. But anyway, when we come back, we'll continue the conversation with Ken Fish, or Senor Pescado, depending on where you're listening. It's Miracle Monday in the Eric Metaxas Show. When we come back, I want to talk about, quote unquote, the prophetic. People talk about the prophetic, and I want to talk to you. We'll be right back. It's the Eric Metaxas Show, metaxastalk.com. Hey, folks, the Eric Metaxas Show. That's Paul McCartney talking about his mother, not about Mary, the mother of God. People think that he was talking about Mary. He had a vision, a dream about his mother, after she'd passed, obviously, and it was very moving to him. And we don't tee up the music like it's just a random loop, but even that reminds me that a lot of the stuff that we talk about, you and I, is normative for most people. It's only the media that says that's wrong or that's weird or that's,
Media and academia.
Yeah, academia is the worst. We don't talk about that on the show because they're just beyond the pale. They don't have the ability to. They don't. I mean, it's like terrible, frankly. It's shameful. But the media still has to respond to some extent to the bottom line.
Right.
And I think if most Americans, most people anywhere, begin to recognize this, eventually the media has to play catch up. Because there's too much of this happening for me to ignore it. I don't care if they're movies starring Steve Martin or whoever where it's a big fake. I know that it's real. Look, you went to Princeton. You didn't study this at Princeton, but you're an intelligent guy. What did you study at Princeton?
Philosophy and history of religion.
Okay, so you're one of those dummies.
But
All right.
it's interesting. I started out studying solid-state physics.
Who didn't, though, Ken? You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying?
And
we all started there. So
I made a transition out of that.
So you're a nerdy, brainy guy, and now we're talking about this kind of stuff. So we were talking before the break about Dr. Bergeron. I had him on the show talking about, he's written a book, actually fantastic.
It was medical documentation of the crucifixion.
It is way beyond anything that's been done before, and he contradicts the previous assumptions that Jesus had to have died from asphyxiation. He says, in fact, no, it happened from blood loss, period. So it was by the blood. It was his bleeding, his blood. Another story. People can read that book or listen to that program. And I want to have him back on here. But you connected with him and some others about medically documenting some of the stuff that you're claiming because it's important. People want to see some science. They want to see some proof.
That's right. So he got in touch with me, and it took us a couple days to connect, but we finally did it. And I gave him 5 case studies that he could, chase down. I had to follow it up by getting in touch with the people first to be sure that they'd be willing to speak with him.
Right.
But he is going to be interviewing them and providing a full suite of documentation. But he's interested in a wider effort even than the 5. And then on top of that, before I ever met him, I've been working with a physician, Stanford educated, who is a professor at Baylor University in Texas. And he is also a practicing physician. So he's both a professor of medicine and a physician. And he has been working with me already for a while on, cases of healing that we get, and he'll follow them up. And I think we talked about this once before, but I'll just say it again for the record. Generally, when people come to get healed, they don't come saying, okay, we're going to make this a control sample where, we get everything in the box here, we do the prayer, and then here's the thing on the back end. So having it proved up that way is harder than you might suppose, even if the healing is unquestionable.
Well, look, it doesn't matter. All you need is a few of these cases. I mean, look, if somebody is deaf and they've gone to a doctor and the doctor can't help them, and then they go and they get their hearing back and they go back to the doctor, that's pretty much good enough for most people. Same thing with what?
Well, I was going to say, on that point, in August, I did a meeting in Houston, and there was a woman who came to the meeting, and she had surgically had the bones in her right ear removed. The cochlea, the sternum.
For cosmetic reasons?
No, this is...
That was a joke. Yes?
So she literally didn't have the equipment to be able to hear because it had been surgically removed. And
why would she have them removed so that she couldn't hear?
No. I mean, she didn't do this for fun. She did it because there was a medical necessity, and when they did the surgery, the outcome was they needed to remove the plumbing of her ear.
Okay.
All right, so she came to this meeting in Houston, and she's one of the case studies I gave to Dr. Bergeron.
Yeah.
And she received prayer, and while we were praying for her, she began to hear again. And she can still hear, but she went back to her doctor, and they can't figure out why she can hear because she still does not have anything there. So on that particular healing, God did not create new bones in her ear, and yet she can hear.
Maybe God is just playing with the doctor's heads. He likes to do that.
Well, he's
sometimes.
obviously playing with hers, right?
Ha! Okay, so there's when we're talking about documenting these kinds of things, you said there's a doctor in where was it?
Well, this other doctor's in Texas.
Okay.
In Houston.
You said he's with Baylor.
He teaches at Baylor.
Okay. There's a man I've had on this show, Craig Keener, Dr. Craig Keener, who's written a 2-volume, I would say magisterial was invented to apply to this, 2-volume work, academic work
Right.
on miracles,
Right.
okay? And I used it when I was writing my own book on miracles. And it's interesting because to venture into the world of academia, you realize that it's so hostile to this kind of thing that it's almost funny. Like they just don't. It's like talking about alchemy or something like that. But I think it's necessary to do, and I think that we're living at a time where laymen are able to appreciate things without the imprimatur of academia. You don't always need to have a PhD to prove things. But it's just fascinating to me. I want to talk to you about you were talking to me earlier about the prophetic.
Yep.
When you say the prophetic, and you talk about, we've talked about wanting revival in America, and I believe that that's the only true hope for America is revival. But how does the prophetic, quote unquote, fit into that?
Well, I'm actually writing a doctoral dissertation on this, so I have a few thoughts.
All right.
To share. But in a nutshell, I think most of the great revivals that you can study in history have somewhere very close to their beginning, you could call it the moment of ignition if you like, some kind of a prophetic word, prophetic ministry, something that has this active living voice of God dynamic to it. And I want to be very clear, this is not just anointed preaching or some sort of a people movement, something that went viral. I mean, it may well go viral, that's for sure. But it has the touch of God. There's something supernatural, something numinous is the academic term for it.
I just used that word yesterday in my manuscript that I'm working on. I love the word numinous. Lumen.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you say that, let's follow up. I mean, if we think about the First Great Awakening with George Whitefield, I don't ever remember hearing anything prophetic there. When we talk about Finney, I don't remember anything.
But you see, this is the issue. Most of the literature that's been produced studying these things is very heavily slanted towards a cessationist point of view, meaning on the parts of the writers.
Yeah.
And with it, there is, how do I want to say it? There's a much stronger emphasis on the teaching side of things and the preaching side of things than on the prophetic side of things.
Okay, and also I would say even farther away from what you're talking about, there's an emphasis on the socioeconomic trends and that kind of thing. I mean, when you're talking about George Whitefield preaching to the colliers and the fishwives and so on and so, they make it sound like something happened in that demographic and there was an egalitarian movement, and all of that stuff may be true.
Right.
But it's not the whole truth. You're saying that there's this whole other thing. And in fact, I know that when Whitefield preached in the 18th century, when Jonathan Edwards preached, we know, I mean, there's tons of firsthand accounts of people behaving in ways that are wild, crazy. We are not talking about people crying and walking down the sawdust trail and making a decision for Jesus. We're talking about people rolling around and screaming and seeing visions.
Or possibly in states of prophetic ecstasy.
Oh, okay. In other words, all of that stuff during these revivals has been documented, but you're saying that typically you don't hear so much about it.
That's right. And, further to what you're saying, if you go back a little bit further and look at particularly the John Wesley revivals, prophetic ministry was all around in those meetings that Wesley was holding, and Wesley himself was something of a student of what were in his time the modern prophets. Now, today, modern means the 21st century, not his century, the 18th century, but Wesley was something of a student of that. And, Wesley had points of view on, say, Montanus, who was the first prophetic revivalist after the ancient church. Montanus lived in the 2nd century. So you see this thread that runs through church history, and I could give you other places where it occurred. The Valdensians would be another example of this. But all of these movements have people in them who speak with the living voice of God, and whether it's words of knowledge, as we call them, data and information about people, or things that have been prophesied about the future that do in fact come to pass. I know there are many times things have fallen to the ground, but
Right.
they do in fact come to pass. There's something of this that arrests the attention of people, and they realize God's alive and he's speaking, and that captures their attention.
Hang on right there. I want to continue this very much. Folks, stick around. It's Miracle Monday. I'm talking to Ken Fish on the Eric Metaxas Show. His website, kingdomfireministries.org. Hey there, folks. It's the Eric Metaxas Show. That's Jackson Brown. You're Ken Fish. I'm Eric Metaxas. And we're talking about the role of the quote-unquote prophetic in revivals. So
Right.
we were just talking about the world of John Wesley. And what you're saying is that when revivals are covered, when people write about them, they tend to shy away from this aspect of it, typically. What is it that brings this to your mind now? Is it that you're seeing something in New York or in America that's leading you to think that there's a revival coming? What is it what's the connection?
Well, let's back up. I've seen this connection historically in my own readings and studies for years, but I didn't really have language for it. And then suddenly, I don't know, you get enough data points and you start to see the overall picture. And I realized that through history, this has gone on. I mean, I could give you examples out of the Bible, several of them actually, where exactly this pattern occurs, that some kind of prophetic trigger is involved and suddenly you have a societal response. And then with that, I started looking around saying, well, what's the confirmatory evidence? And I'll just give you kind of an intermediate point and then jump to the modern, very modern period. But in the 1950s, there was a move of God in this country that came to be known as the Latter Rain Revival. And one of the leaders of that revival was a man named Gordon Lindsay, and he had a woman that traveled with him, and there was nothing funny going on. Gordon Lindsay was married, and everything was right as it should be.
Right.
But this woman, her name was Anna Schrader, and she would prophesy in these meetings, and there was something catalytic in her prophesying, and ultimately she wrote a number of volumes of the prophetic words and messages she delivered, and they were called The Spirit Speaks by Prophecy. But the Latter Rain Revival had a gigantic impact on America in the 1950s. In fact, I can remember talking with a friend of mine who was a complete and total atheist, and they were commenting on these great healing revivals and people who were barnstorming across America, and why did all these people come? And it was just astounding. They couldn't deny that there'd been this mass movement of people in that period. Today, almost no one remembers that or even talks about it. But that was catalyzed in part by the prophesying of this woman, Anna Schrader.
Okay, now, I didn't know of Anna Schrader, but I know that in that period, Oral Roberts was doing a lot of healing.
He was one of those people.
So he's one of the figures that people would know about.
That's right. And in those years, he hadn't seen whatever it was, 600 or 900 foot tall Jesus. So he had credibility. And Oral Roberts had a very prolific healing ministry, but he also had prophetic people around him who functioned in the comparable role to Anna Schrader.
And then, of course, slightly on another note, you had Bishop Sheen, had the most popular television program in America. He was a Catholic bishop talking about God and Jesus. It was part of the mainstream. And then you had Billy Graham really everywhere in the 1950s.
That's right.
Doing crusades here in New York, Madison Square Garden in 1957, and on and on and on and on. So there was kind of a general revival of Christian faith going on in the culture.
That's right.
But I had not heard about the Latter Rain prophecies.
Well, the Latter Rain Revival was more what we would call Pentecostal.
Yeah.
Bishop Sheen was Roman Catholic.
Yeah.
And Billy Graham was what we would call mainstream evangelical.
Right.
But the ignition point for this was actually among the Pentecostals, and the spark plug was this prophetic ministry that was going on in conjunction with the other preaching.
Yeah.
So almost by definition, you can see that this prophesying is not preaching as we commonly understand it.
Right.
And if you move it forward, you start to see more and more of that. So right now, there's things going on in America that have been underway for 30 years, and a lot of that got its initial impetus out of a group of prophetic ministers that came out of the Midwest.
Kansas City.
The
Kansas City Prophets.
That's
Is that
correct.
a baseball team?
No.
I always think it should be a baseball team, the Kansas City Prophets. So the Kansas City Prophets, I mean, because, you think, can anything good come out of Kansas City? What are we even talking about?
Well, I don't know. The Royals came out of Kansas City.
True.
Okay.
But I guess my question is, it always sounds sort of funny when you say there's this thing going on in Kansas City, or there's this thing going on at the Toronto airport, or there's this thing going on in Pensacola.
Right.
And you think, these things are going on, but no one knows about it because the mainstream media would never touch it with a 10-foot
Correct.
barge pole. It's just not the kind of thing that comes, to anybody. But you're saying that those kinds of things indicate to you that there's something coming.
Exactly, because we have the prophetic initiator that's already going on. And of note, in most of the things that are happening right now, I'll pick something that some of our listeners and viewers may be familiar with. Bethel Church in Redding, California.
Yeah.
Every year they hold a School of the Prophets. One of the two senior leaders of that church, they call him a prophet, and they raise and train prophetic ministers at Bethel. There are others that do the same thing. Cheon at Harvest Rock Church in Pasadena, California.
Yeah.
But in and around these things that are going on, they have a culture of prophetic ministry where they're developing people
Right.
in this gift.
Okay,
And
right.
it's part of what fuels it.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to continue this conversation. And then later on, I want to talk to you about miracles you have been seeing around you, crazy stuff. Folks, stick around. It's the Eric Metaxas Show. All right, we're going to find out Pretty Mama. That's how you know it's from the 70s, because in those days, you would say stuff like that. We're
Right.
going to find out Pretty Mama.
It's toxic masculinity now.
Foxy lady. You said something funny to me about my bumper music, about the Eagles.
Yeah.
What did you say?
Well, I said it's perhaps circumstantial, but interesting that the bumper music that came up as we ended the last session and now start this one is the Eagles, because you said it's random. No one's pre-programming this.
I think James programmed the Eagles just now to come up because we were talking about it, but the first time it was random.
Okay, well, and I said, among people who move in circles of prophecy and prophetic community, the eagle is pretty universally understood to be the bird that is the image or the mascot of the prophetic community.
And why? Because he can see far from a high distance.
He can see far, and he rides on currents of the wind, which the wind is a metaphor of the Spirit.
The Holy Spirit, yeah. Well, let's go back. You were just saying that there have been things happening in the last number of decades. Kansas City Prophets, I think of people like Mike Bickle, and some people know these names. A lot of people listening have no clue
They have no
who
idea,
we're talking about. Paul Cain, I met Paul Cain. And some of these people. The only question is, I've been hearing about this stuff, since like 1990, and it is now almost 30 years since I've been hearing about this stuff. So why wouldn't the revival have been happening contemporaneously with all of this prophetic stuff?
Well, in fact, in certain segments of American society, there is quite a groundswell of, what do you want to call it, renewed faith going on, but it hasn't hit the top end of the register. So the kind of the political structures, the media structures, that sort of thing.
Christianity Today is not going to cover it.
It's funny. Christianity Today recently ran an article on some of this.
On what?
The prophetic ministry.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's been in the last couple of months.
Fantastic.
I take it. Yeah, and I mean they were not wholeheartedly embracing it, but they were at least addressing it.
Well, I just find it interesting because typically, the evangelical world, the world of Wheaton, out of which you get Christianity Today, they tend to avoid that. I mean, Stephen Strang and Charisma and other magazines will focus on
That's
this
correct.
stuff. But
That's right.
Let's talk about this then. You're saying that you do think that there's some kind of revival brewing.
Yes.
Now, I've heard people say this forever, and so I get very frustrated because I want nothing more than revival. So why would you say there's anything different now from, people? I've heard people talk about this for a long time.
Yeah. Well, okay, so let's talk about a relatively modern case study. In the 1970s and into the early 80s, there was something known as the Jesus People movement.
Yeah.
It was a revival, and it was principally focused not in the halls of power. It really impacted what we would call the hippie community.
Yeah.
And depending on whose numbers you read and believe, on the low end, about 2 million people came to faith in the Jesus revival. And on the upper end, about 9 million came to faith. But you know what was the trigger point for all of that? Well, there was a man who was a preacher, and his name was Chuck Smith. He's now with the Lord. And he had a sidekick right beside him named Lonnie Frisbee, who was a prophet. And Lonnie's prophesying was just as important as Chuck Smith's preaching. I'm not taking away from Chuck. I just don't want to deny
Lonnie
Lonnie's
comes
place.
out like he's a complicated figure, sort of screwy in some ways. I don't have the details on it, but I know that he was for real, so you can't dismiss him.
I knew him.
You did?
Yeah, he was a friend of mine. I traveled with him for about a year.
When was that?
In the early 80s.
Okay, so this is John Wimber, Lonnie Frisbee, Chuck Smith. Now, my friend whom I've had on this show so many times from Orange County, California, who was part of that
Greg Laurie.
whole Greg
came
and
to
his
faith
wife
under Lonnie's ministry.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And so I know a little bit about that. Greg just wrote a book called Jesus Revolution, documenting all of this stuff. And so because I'm friends with Greg, I've heard about this. And it does seem to me sort of bizarre that we've forgotten about that movement, because I could even say that I came to faith out of that movement. I mean, I came to faith officially in 1988, but it was on the back of that movement, because the St. Paul's Darien, which was a church in Connecticut, in Darien, Connecticut, there was a book written about it in the 70s by the Slossers, and it was like part of this huge upsurge of charismatic stuff. And I mean, it was just explosive, and all of those people were still there when I went to that church. You could feel it in the DNA, and the age of the people. It was something that had happened, and all those people are, incredibly faithful people to this day. They're still out there and stuff. So it's had a big effect. But you're suggesting that we're on the cusp of something similar.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And one of the data points I would point to is you have these schools of the prophets that are going on in various places. As I mentioned, Bethel is one place that does it, but there are others that do it. H-Rock Church in Pasadena, California, every year they hold what they call their Prophetic Destiny Conference. It's usually held early in the year. They just finished it. We're in February now. It happened in January. And I could name others. I don't need to make the list long, but the point is it's going on. And part of the idea is we're raising companies of prophets, people who can prophesy accurately and with value. And that is, I don't think people are thinking about it the way I am. I view it as an ignition point for revival. They're just doing it without the language for it that I'm creating in my dissertation. But the phenomenon is the same, and it's remarkably consistent with other moves of God that we can document through history. And so with that, I look at it and I go, this is how God does it. This is part of his MO. And therefore, we should be encouraged that something is brewing and coming soon.
And I would say that part of the reason that I and our friend Matt Bennett keep inviting you to New York is because something like that is happening in New York. There are small groups of people that are kind of learning the ropes of this. It's not sui generis, to use a Latin term. It's just the kind of thing that you have to learn how to do it, how not to do it, how to shepherd the talent, so to speak, if you have that kind of a talent. And I have seen that. I've seen people that I know here in New York begin to move in this kind of stuff where 3 years ago they didn't. So it is interesting to me. And of course, I would like nothing more than to see revival happen. It's the only thing that can save us, so to speak. It doesn't mean I'm not political, but I know where ultimately any good has to come from, and that's God. So we're going to be right back talking to Ken Fish. We've got more actual miracles in hour 2. We're going to talk about some crazy stuff. Stick around. It's the Eric and Taxis Show. Hey folks, it's the Eric and Taxis Show talking to Ken Fish. The website is kingdomfireministries.org, kingdomfireministries.org. I want people to find you, Ken Fish, because I'm aware of all the stuff that you're doing. There's so much. In an hour 2, we'll talk more specifically. But right now, when we're talking about revival now, I know that we need revival in America. There's no political hope. I mean, the politics is downstream of this. People talk about culture. This is the stem cell. Nothing good anywhere comes if you don't have God's hand. So What can people do personally along these lines?
Well, I mean, it sounds almost cliche, but the first thing they can do is pray. Pray for awakening, but I would say pray as well that God would raise up prophets. And I'll say more about that in a moment. The next thing they can do is maybe consider going to one of these conferences or buy some books written by some of the people who are, doing this sort of thing, and start learning about it, both so they can be informed, but possibly even to activate themselves and start to be practitioners.
When you read books like this, Suzanne, my wife, read a book by Bill
Heyman.
No, sorry, from Bethel.
Oh, Johnson, Bill Johnson.
Bill Johnson. And I think she read a book by Randy Clark. And it really is interesting. When you read those books, something does happen. You begin to get faith for this kind of stuff. I know you're working on a book. You're working too slowly on the book because I can't wait to see it. I can't wait to see it. Okay, what else? We've got a couple of minutes.
Okay, so I think those are some good first steps to take. And then if people really get into it, well, obviously they can attach themselves to a prophetic community and dive deep into the river if that's what they want to do. But, I started out by saying people can pray and ask for this sort of thing to start out. We see a model of this in the Bible. In Daniel chapter 9, Daniel suddenly understands. He has a revelation, if you want to say it that way. Right. When he's reading Jeremiah's prophecy that in 6 years the Jews are going to get to go home. That's the way the math works out. It doesn't say it that way, but that's what it says.
Yeah.
So he realizes that, and he begins to pray. As he prays, he has an angelic visitation. Well, that's a prophetic experience. And then, as he continues praying into that, as a result of Daniel's prayers, he has his revelation in 522 BC. In the year 520, the Spirit of God falls on a man named Haggai and another man named Zechariah, more than 1,000 miles away in Jerusalem. Daniel's a captive in what was Babylon, but is now Persia. And more than 1,000 miles away, there's a prophetic release. And what does that do? It triggers the rebuilding of the temple.
Say what?
It triggers the rebuilding of the temple, the second temple.
That's kind of big stuff.
It is. It's huge. But the Bible itself documents this.
Yeah.
And you see right there, Haggai and Zechariah, it says they were there alongside of Zerubbabel, the secular leader, and Joshua, the high priest, prophesying into them, and with that you get I'll call it a renaissance now.
Right, and of course the cessationists would say, yeah, but that's then, this is now, we have the canon of Scripture, we don't need that. They would be wrong, but we don't have time to tell them how. We're going to come back, we'll do a second hour with you, and also I want to say, you do conferences everywhere, and if people want to find out where they are, they can go to kingdomfireministries.org.
That's right.
Because I hate when people say, oh, I wish I had known. kingdomfireministries.org. You go all around the world, and I hope people will avail themselves of your teaching and your ministry. My friend Ken Fish, thanks for being my guest.
It's always great to be here, Eric.
Welcome to the Eric Metaxas Show. Today, Eric will interview a man with the head of a turkey. No joke. The rest of his body is perfectly normal, but his tiny turkey head is very unnerving. It's teeny weeny. And now, Eric Metaxas.
Thank you, my friend. I have to apologize to my guest, Ken Fish. Ken, I know you had past tense a head the size of a turkey, and Todd didn't know that you'd been healed. And so I just want to say that's not Todd's fault.
Okay.
And all glory to God, because look at that head. It's a normal human-sized head.
Amazing.
Anybody who can see this on Metaxas Super, or if we put this on YouTube, they can see that amazingly your head is not what Todd
every
knew
now and
that
then,
it was.
This urge overcomes me, and I want to go.
Well, look, it's gonna have to work itself out over time. You don't expect everything to be, but just the fact that your head isn't the size of a turkey head, I'm going to call that progress.
Okay.
All right.
Good.
So we're going to talk about some real healings now, not fake healings. You have experienced so much that when I talk to you, sometimes I laugh because you're in the healing ministry. You've seen all this stuff, and I always want to stop you and say, "What? What did you say? Give me the details and give me the." But you're moving so fast, and you're praying for people, and you move on. You get in a plane, you do all this different stuff. So I just want to talk to you today about some of the things you've seen recently, because we were together. What was it? December? I can't remember when we did the show last, or November.
Yeah, it was December.
But what have you been witnessing recently? And by the way, since I didn't introduce you properly, your name is Ken Fish, and the website is kingdomfireministries.org. Ministries.org. But you've been on the program so much that I assume people listening sort of know who you are. But yeah, what's going on?
Well, one of the things that we haven't talked a lot about when we've been together in the past is mental health. We've talked a lot about physical healings and demons, and angels, but mental health has not been one that we've discussed very much.
Principally because I have never heard of anybody being healed of mental illness. In other words, you hear about people being healed of cancer. You hear about people having their legs healed and they can walk again. You hear about tumors disappearing. You hear about all that kind of stuff over and over and over. At least I do.
Yeah.
But when somebody says that we prayed for healing of mental illness, you're the only person I've ever heard mention that.
Well, years ago I was reading the writings of a man named John Lake. And Lake writes in his material about how he had gone to the Lord and entreated him, which we don't even use that language these days, but he entreated the Lord and begged him to give him dominion over mental illness.
You mean to translate this to English, you mean he prayed?
He prayed earnestly.
And he asked God to help him heal mental illness.
That's
now,
correct.
had he healed physical illness before?
He had quite a prolific healing ministry physically at that point.
Okay.
So he began asking for this, and presently it began to happen in his ministry. And I remember Lake was somebody who really inspired me. And as I read that material, I thought, God, I want you to let me see people with mental illness get healed also. And it's a funny thing when you start dealing in that specific domain, because you start getting hate mail. Because people say, well, how dare you imply that those people are less than anyone else, which I'm not implying that. I'm just saying God intended that they not have those challenges and limitations.
Well, I suppose it depends what it is that we're talking about. You're always going to get letters from people. People are crazy. People are misguided, and you have to be careful what you even listen to or read. But I guess the question, so we can focus here, is when you say mental illness, there's an infinite variety
That's
of
correct.
mental illness. I've talked about struggling with depression. I have had friends with dementia. There's a vast range. There's schizophrenia, which is very serious. You've even talked about praying with people with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and things like that. And I think, whoa, this is, where are we going with this?
Well, at the moment, I'm not thinking so much about Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, although we have seen people healed of that. But I'm thinking about things like schizophrenia, psychosis, bipolar, things like that.
Yeah.
And we do see a reasonable amount of that get healed. It's not every single person, but it's a lot of them. And in fact, the other night, I was in Ohio, and I walked into the church, and this woman came up to me and said, I heard you on the Eric Metaxas show, and we've driven here from more than 2 hours away, and we brought our son, who's a schizophrenic, and we'd like you to pray with him. Well, it was before the service. I said, I can't do that just now, but after I preach and we start the ministry time, we'll do that. And I spent some time with him, but at the end of that evening, the young man who was 20 years old, he was reporting to me in his own words, from his own mouth. He said, the voices in my head are still. There is nothing talking to me inside my head.
Okay, but just to be clear, to backtrack, when we're talking about schizophrenia, because it's sort of a complicated issue, in some cases, and in his case, he was hearing voices in his head.
Yes.
And this was constant?
Yes. Virtually constant. I think there might have been moments of quiet, but nothing
now,
long.
If you don't mind my asking, when people say they're hearing voices in their head, I don't really know what that means. Whose voices and what are they saying? What is this another part of your personality that's speaking to you? I know that doctors might say that.
Yeah.
But what do you say? Are these demonic voices sometimes? What do you say is happening in these cases? Not all cases, but in some cases.
Sometimes it could be demonic. Other times it could be dissociated parts of the personality.
So then you concede it could be a person's own voice being internalized.
Yeah. So anyway, this young man, he'd been having voices all evening as they drove to this church where we were holding the service. And as I said, at the end of the prayer time, he said, the voices are quiet. I don't have any voices going on. And I continued to dialogue with him for about 30 minutes, and he didn't have any voices. But equally as impressive, he had a whole realm of information in his brain which he had been unable to access. He had learned that information. He knew that he knew the information, but it was like the door had been closed and locked, and he just couldn't get in there.
And this is information from years before or more recently?
Both. Some of it was newer, some was older. But as we were talking, I said, well, can you access your information? And he said, yes. And he started reciting things. And he said, I couldn't do this earlier this evening. And he, continued to do that.
Well, I mean, I guess the question is, because we don't know about these things and we don't know this person, were there periods in the last year when the voices had stopped? In other words, what is to say?
No. As I said, there might have been 5 minutes at a time here or there, but essentially it was a continuous feed of voices in his head. And in his case, he told me they weren't his voice. It was kind of a harsh, hissing sort of, you are terrible. You should just end it. It'll be better for you. That kind of a thing.
Don't do that again. You're freaking me out, man. So this sounds like those were. It sounds to me like those are demonic voices.
Yeah, potentially so. But what I really want to say is the voices went quiet, and also the data that he had lost was accessible. Now, I am not a psychiatrist. I am not a psychologist. I am not a psychotherapist. But I know enough to know that when someone is self-reporting in that way, something is happening, and that's the kind of outcome we want to see.
Right.
I told his parents who brought him, I said, take him home and have his clinician diagnose him and talk with him further and see if they need to adjust his medication or whatever. So I'm not ready to report him as fully healed, but I am ready to say something meaningful happened by his own testimony.
And you said that his parents corroborated that in their reaction.
Oh, well, his mother was standing there in tears and just sobbing because she's the one that had approached me before the service and said, we brought our son, and could you please pray for our son? We heard that maybe God will do something.
Yeah.
And as she watched this happen, she said, I can't believe that this, he's not hearing voices, and how can this is, she really didn't even have language for it.
Well, I think it's important to say that because it helps people like me understand that even if you don't know what happened, something happened, right?
Right.
That if the mother herself, who's his principal caregiver, is in tears, obviously something happened. So the question is, will it last? Will it get better? But that's amazing. For somebody even to talk about praying for the healing of schizophrenia, I've never heard that until I met you, because there's so many people dealing with this, and it's sort of hopeless for those people. So the idea, we're going to go to a break. We'll be right back. Folks, talking to Ken Fish, his website, kingdomfireministries.org. Hey, folks, it's the Eric Metaxas Show. That's Elton John. I'm Eric. And you, my guest, are Ken Fish. Ken, it's Miracle Monday on the program. Whenever you're on, I would say it's Miracle Monday. And your website is kingdomfireministries.org. You just said to me something I don't want to forget. You said that shortly there's going to be a conference. You are going to be presiding over a conference for the healing of mental illness in Los Angeles.
Yes, that's right.
The conference will be in Los Angeles. Do you know where?
It'll be at a church called Jesus Center.
Jesus Center. That's pretty focused.
Yep.
Jesus Center, and it's going to be, do you know the date?
February 15 and 16, so we're about 2 weeks away.
Okay. Well, we won't be 2 weeks away when this airs because we'll probably have to hold this. But you, so anybody can come to this?
It's open to anyone who wants to come.
Okay, so if they go to kingdomfireministries.org, they can sign up in the LA area, February 15th and 16th. This makes me happy because we've talked about this. What you do is very important to me, and I want more and more people to have access to it because there's so many people with problems, with relatives with problems, with friends with problems, and they don't know where to go. And you tell me some remarkable stories of people who can't find hope, and then somehow, and this is not to say that everyone you pray for is healed or that everyone you pray for is pulled back from the brink of death. I mean, it's we have to be clear about that here. That you're not
this isn't magic.
You're not a magus. You're just a human being that God uses to heal for people. Okay, so what other stuff have we seen? You want to keep talking about?
This story is about 4 years old, but I was overseas, and they brought a woman and asked me to pray for her, and she had psychosis. And she had been that way for about 25 years.
Okay, what is psychosis?
In her case, she was having both visual and auditory hallucinations.
And this is someplace in Asia.
No, this was in Australia.
No, I say it's Asia. It was Australia. Yeah. Okay, so you're in Australia. Okay, what happens?
So they bring the woman to me and they ask me, will you pray for her? And it's kind of a long story, so I'll just abbreviate it and say that in her specific case, God gave me a word of knowledge about something in her family's past. And it involved actually an abortion that her mother had had.
Okay, we have to be clear for people who don't understand. God gave you a word of knowledge. That's a fancy term for God spoke to you.
Gave me some insight into
about this woman.
Correct.
While you're ministering to her. And
That's
this
right.
helps. It's like a key that unlocks
a door.
A door. Okay,
Right.
so you hear from God that there's an abortion in her family.
That's right. And it had been her mother had aborted the first child she had conceived. And this woman was child number 2. And so as in the aftermath of that, there'd been another child born. And so the mother who'd aborted the child and both of these daughters had knowledge of this event, but no one else in the family did. It happened in a period when abortion was not legal in Australia, so they just kind of covered it up, kept it quiet. But this had happened, and they were all, in one way or another, I'd say complicit, because they all knew about it and were keeping it quiet.
Okay, complicit, in other words, the mother, the woman you're praying for, and her sister.
And yes, and the other daughter, that's
Okay.
correct. So anyway, the Lord addressed this issue in the family line, and then the Lord healed this woman of her psychosis. And the two were linked, but I want to be careful how I even say that, because I don't want our listeners or viewers to think that I'm saying psychotic people are all, somehow involved with abortion. That would be a gross misstatement. But anyway, we got through all of that, and then this woman went into, in this case, a very loud and long pronounced demonic manifestation, and this spirit of psychosis left her. And it took about 90 seconds of screaming and yelling as it came out. It was a very long, wailing, kind of thing. And then she was lying on the floor sobbing, and she had been foaming at the mouth as this was going on, as described in the Bible with some demoniacs. And when she got up off the floor, she looked me in the eye, and she said, "It's gone." And I said, "What's gone?" She said, "That thing that's been in my brain all these years, it's gone." And her eyes looked different. You could see that something was different. So she got up and went home that night. Now, as I mentioned, she'd been in this kind of psychotic state for 25 years. She'd been held against her wishes in mental hospitals on 3 separate occasions, once for more than a decade.
Oh.
And she'd had electroconvulsive therapy, she'd had all the drugs, everything. And she was now able to, function. After this happened, she went to her attending physicians. There were 3 of them. And the physicians wrote a discharge report for her, and they said, in our combined 90 years of experience in mental health, we have never seen a case of psychosis healed, but we consider this woman to be healed. No further treatment necessary. So that's one of the most powerful and profound ones that I've seen, but it's indicative of what God is willing to do for those who are afflicted with mental illness.
Well, it's interesting because when you have 3 physicians write that, it strikes me that, you ought to put together a book just of those kinds of things. If you tell that story.
You're telling me to write another book.
Well, I mean, you can have somebody write that for you. You don't have to. All I'm saying is that to recount the details of that, and then to get the names of those doctors, you can have somebody do that. But I'm saying that's really significant when 3 doctors are willing to concede something like that. They're not saying that it was Jesus, but they're saying that we've never seen anything like this. I just think it's fascinating, and you don't read about stuff like that.
Right.
So you've had so many experiences like that over the course of your 30 years of doing this, that I think it's worth putting them together. I think it's important.
Yep.
I wish I could help you somehow, because I just feel like it's important for people to read these things.
Well, I think, as I kind of transition into this season of book writing, I'll probably have a number of books that I can put out, and that type of a book would certainly be on the list, because I think I've got a few things to say about how people get healed of these kinds of conditions. And, we see a lot of people get free of mental illnesses of various types in our meetings, sometimes in private appointments. But however it happens, there's good things going on.
Well, part of what's interesting, and I think it certainly bears saying, is that you have great experience with this. In other words, it's not like you just pray. You pray, and God uses you in your prayers. But beyond that, first of all, you just mentioned having the gift of hearing from God and getting words of knowledge. Mm-hmm. I've had that maybe once or twice in my life, but you periodically, regularly, I should say, hear things from God that unlock the problem and that give you deeper insight and to tell you how to pray, what to say. So people who don't have that, are at a great disadvantage. I can pray for someone, but I don't know that I will hear something. I would like to think that at some point I would develop that skill. But then, even having heard something, to know what to do with it. You have so much experience and insight into how to unravel these things. And it's not as simple as I pray in the name of Jesus and stuff happens. It's more complicated. You're like an actual doctor who you look at the situation. You're trying to diagnose what's the way in.
Right. Yeah, I do that. That's correct. And in fact, on that point, we're on Monday here. It's Miracle Monday. A couple of days ago, I was up in the Bronx, and I was preaching at a church up there, and they brought a young man to me, and he had a lot of stuff going on in his life, and I think he was a believer, but I wouldn't say he was living anything that approximated a victorious Christian life. And so the pastor wanted me to pray for him, and his friends wanted me to pray for him. And I started to pray for him, and the Spirit of God was moving on him. And then just as I looked at him, I was looking kind of here high on his left chest, and all of a sudden I saw a building. And as I looked at it, I understood that it was a youth correctional facility. And I said, "Have you done time in the youth correctional facility here in New York?" And he goes, "Yes, I have." And I said, "And what was that for?" And he said what it was. I won't say it on the air, but he told me what it was. And I said, "And there was also this involved, wasn't there?" And he went, Now, the Lord had pinned him with the youth correctional facility word, but then I added to what he had just acknowledged. And then it was like if you've ever cut a watermelon open on a hot summer day and the paths, it was like that. And heaven opened, and he just disintegrated, and God met him.
Okay, we're going to be right back. I want to ask you more about that and a lot of other stuff. Folks, talking to Ken Fish, the website kingdomfireministries.org. This is the Eric Metaxas Show. Thanks for listening. Hey there, folks. I'm talking to Ken Fish. Ken, welcome to the program.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
It's great to talk to you. You just shared something like a big deal. You said this is last week in the Bronx. A young man is brought to you. Did they tell you what the issue was with him? What did they say?
No, they didn't tell me anything. They just said he needs help.
They didn't tell you anything?
No.
He needs help.
Yeah. I mean, he lives in the Bronx. He needs help. I mean, you could guess, right? Drugs, alcohol, weapons, pregnant girlfriend. I mean, you could guess what it might be, but they didn't tell me anything.
But why wouldn't they? I guess I don't understand. Why wouldn't they tell you what he needs help with and what you're supposed to guess? I don't get it.
Well, I mean, when they bring somebody like that, obviously a conversation's going to ensue. So I suppose they figured I'll sort it out.
So he had some, it sounds like he had some serious sin issues, like he'd done some stuff that was very bad.
Yeah, he'd had that. And he had, as many troubled youth do, an absentee father and a very broken, dysfunctional home life with mom had men in and out of the house. I mean, these are social pathologies that need to be fixed. And, we have to be careful how we talk about them, and people are hypersensitized today. But there's no question that having a good, stable home with a father in it as well as a mother is an important part of keeping people whole.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. But you pray for this man, and suddenly God miraculously gives you the key. You mention it. It kind of blows his mind. And so what is happening there? In other words, when you do that to him and he goes, like, how did you know? He knows God is there because he knows.
Absolutely knows.
He knows there's no way you could know what you just said.
Well, and this goes right into what we were talking about on the front end of this show with
Yeah.
the role of prophetic and awakening, right? That was a prophetic moment for him where, in the language of people who do prophetic ministry, his mail got read. And with that, now he has an understanding that God isn't just a theory. God is real, and God is here, and he's speaking to me.
And he knows you.
Right.
Intimately.
He
knows
knows
what
me
you've
intimately.
done, and
That's
he
right.
loves you, and he wants to, yeah.
And, you know,
Okay.
we see this in the Bible, right? When Jesus first meets Nathanael,
Yeah.
Nathanael comes to him and he goes, here's a man who has no guile in him. He's pure of heart. He has no ulterior motives. And so as Nathanael approaches him, Jesus says that, and he goes, well, how do you know me? I mean, we just met. How would you know I'm a man like that? And Jesus says, well, you know, before you came here, you were sitting under a fig tree, and my assistant, Philip, called you and brought you to me. And he goes, you saw me under the fig tree? And that immediately convinces him. So he goes, Rabbi, you're the Son of God. You're the King of Israel. And Jesus goes, that's all it took to convince you? Well, apparently that's all it took to convince him. And so that shows you the power of this prophetic kind of ministry to pierce into the hearts of men and women, to divide the secret from what they're willing to share, and to lay bare the idea that, God is here, but he's not here to humiliate or embarrass you. He's here to actually help you in your distress.
Well, what happened practically? In other words, once this guy realizes this is for real, you said, did you see what you call manifestations? Did you see him?
He started crying, and then he started retching and coughing because he had some spirits that he needed deliverance from.
Okay.
And then he got some inner
You always say
healing.
these things so matter-of-factly that I find it hilarious. He started coughing and retching because he had these demonic spirits that he needed deliverance from. Like, that's not normal in my world, and in most people listening, they're like, what? But you see this so often.
We got a growing cadre of people here in New York who see it all the
Right,
time.
no big deal.
Yeah.
No, but it is fascinating, and I know a lot of people listening that they just don't buy it, but you're saying that immediately good things started happening, and he started to manifest these demonic things coming out of him.
That's right.
Wow.
So, like I say, that's a 2-day-old story from the north end of Manhattan.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was great.
What else is going on in your life? You do a lot of traveling. Do you see the same things happening here in New York as you see happening in Australia or in Africa or in Asia?
Yes, I do. I might see possibly more of them in places like Africa and Asia. And I think it's partially because, in general, people are more open to this sort of thing, whereas in New York, there's a lot of the talk to the hand kind of response. But I do see the same kinds of things in New York as I see in other lands, yes.
And what is your sense of the spiritual condition of this country right now? Because you do see, you get around the country, you see things happening. I am generally hopeful. I feel like we're in a real spiritual battle with forces of confusion and darkness and lying voices. And
I would agree.
It's very dark. And I think there's a prophet, I can't remember his name, but he reminds me of Mr. Haney from Green Acres, and very sweet man. And he talks about this kind of thing. And he talks about the Jezebelic spirit. You see all of this kind of stuff. And of course, the media, not just the mainstream media, the media in general completely ignores this. They're either ignorant of it or very hostile to it. But it does seem that we're in the middle of a spiritual battle. There seems to me no other explanation for the madness we're seeing right now.
I agree with that, yeah.
Any other thoughts on that?
Well, so what's interesting is it's always darkest before the dawn, and on the one hand, we spoke earlier in the show about these things that are starting to bubble up, the kind of the front end of revival.
I didn't realize we're just going to a break. Hold that thought.
Okay.
Hold that sentence, folks. We're talking to Ken Fish, kingdomfireministries.org. Stick around. It's the Eric Metaxas Show. Hey there, folks. It's the Eric Metaxas Show, talking to Ken Fish. Ken Fish, you were just in the middle of making a point about where we are spiritually in this nation. I would even say in Europe, there are... You see big trends, right? You see these kind of cultural elites that it's like they know that their time draweth nigh, and they're raging and gnashing their teeth and acting out because they don't want to be cast into the Gadarene swine and go over the cliff. And so you're seeing a level of drama and whether literal screaming or metaphorical screaming. To me, to some extent, it's a good sign. Something is happening, but it's a battle.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And you've got, as I said, or was starting to say, you've got these kind of twin things going on. You've got this kind of beginnings of a revival, this incipient awakening that I was speaking of earlier, and you've got all of this other stuff, this darkness that's going on. I mean, I am astounded at what happened in New York State recently, very recently, with this law that allows infanticide of viable infants. I mean, this is against the Hippocratic Oath. It's against at least 1,500 years of Western medical tradition that a viable child should be allowed to be terminated for no other reason than we don't want the child. And in fact, I would double down on that and say that in the early church, one of the main things they spoke out against was what they called the exposure of infants, but it was infanticide because they would just say, we don't want this baby, and they'd leave it out in the cold and let it die of hypothermia.
Just like the governor of Virginia would like to do, except he'd like it to be comfortable as it is murdered.
Right.
It's interesting.
So it's astounding to me that this is happening in America because you know, one of the things that we said even in the Second World War was that, you know, the Nazis are gruesome people, not just because they're gassing the Jews, but because they're engaging in eugenics. And I wonder if that's the next thing on the agenda. We'll just round up all the undesirables and start eliminating.
It's effectively happening. I mean, you know, the undesirables are kids with Down syndrome, people with, you know, we talked about this on the air the other day. How many times have I heard people say that when my wife was pregnant, the doctor said, and they would scare the heck out of them and basically saying, look, we are advising you to abort. And these people say, we will never abort. We don't care what you're saying. We will have this child, even though this child is going to be very messed up. We're going to pray for the kid and love the kid until God takes the kid. And over again, the kid is born and everything's fine. I've heard these stories dozens of times. But there's this, it's almost like a death wish in the culture, like death will solve everything.
Well, isn't that what, I mean, I know it's sometimes risky to bring up the Pope, but didn't the Pope say, it was John Paul II, that we live in a culture of death?
Oh, of course. I mean, he was the first one.
We're embracing it wholesale.
It's not exactly controversial to bring up John Paul II. If you bring up Francis, that's controversial. John Paul II and Benedict are the gold standard. And I have to say that when you're talking about a culture of death, it's like we are sprinting back to paganism.
I agree.
Like we're sprinting back to a different view of humanity and everything. So it is really dark. But what is your sense of where it's going? Because different people, I mean, you're not exactly a prophet, but you move in the prophetic. What is your sense as you hear different people talk about this kind of stuff?
Well, I think the Lord is releasing something in America that is confronting all of this. And back to what you said on the front end of this segment, because of that, we're getting enormous pushback from those that want to take America in this direction. But, you know, there's a lot at stake here. There's the viability of our country. But I would say more than that, the very values and principles that founded Western civilization, whether it be in Europe or America, I think all of these are being challenged and are very much up for grabs.
Well, they've been challenged
for a while.
Since before the 60s. And then political correctness hit right around when I began Yale, I remember in the early 80s being for the first time exposed to this kind of thinking, and I had not seen it before. I mean, I grew up in a working class immigrant home in a working class town. I'd never seen this stuff before, but the idea that in a way Western civilization was the problem as opposed to the solution.
Right.
I never had encountered that before, and I'm writing about that a little bit in my book, my spiritual memoir that I'm working on right now, because it's fascinating to think that this stuff has been building and building and building, and I think we've had politicians who've pretty much played patty cake with it. They don't want to take it on head on. Mm-hmm. And we have a president now who cannot help but take it head on. He somehow seems built to do that, for good and for ill. It's a complicated thing. It's a little bit like Martin Luther, where you have this maniac, and people don't like the fact that sometimes he behaves like a maniac, but he's going to do it anyway, and you're sort of watching this thing play out that has not played out. I mean, if Jeb Bush or any of those folks had been elected, you get the idea that they would sort of go along with this because they don't want this ugly fight.
Yeah, they don't want to rock the boat. Yeah. And, the thing is, there have been times in history, and again, I'll go back to the Bible, where God has raised up prophets, and they have been involved in what we could call a societal reformation to bring people back out of the darkness of the times in which they lived into some kind of a new view of God, but it's an authentic view of God. That's probably the best way to say it.
Yeah.
One of the good examples is during the reform of Josiah, which is recorded both in 2 Chronicles and 2 Kings. Josiah kind of got underway with what he was doing, and then God raised up the prophet Jeremiah in the 13th year of Josiah's reign, and Jeremiah prophesied right alongside of Josiah. And then after Josiah died, Jeremiah kept on prophesying, so he outlived him. But the point is, Jeremiah was a prophet who spoke into that time.
Yeah.
And so we're right back to where we were talking in the beginning about this prophetic role. And, the church has always said, and I don't care if you're a Calvinist or a Wesleyan or what you are, the church has always said that the church is a prophetic people.
Yeah.
We as a people of God are intended to speak the heart of God to the times in which we live. And I think that voice is being recovered.
We're going to be right back, final segment in this hour with Ken Fish. It's the Eric Metaxas Show. Stick around.
Slow down, but he's got the
hey there, folks. It's the Eric Metaxas Show, talking to my friend Ken Fish. Ken, very little time left in this hour. What are some of the other things that you have seen recently that you might want to tell people about to encourage them along these lines?
Well, this one could maybe rock a few people's world, but you might remember there was a movie that came out probably 2 years ago. M. Night Shyamalan produced it, called Split.
I didn't see that movie, but his movies are amazing. His movie Signs is one of the most amazing movies I've seen.
So anyway, he came out with this movie Split, and it's about somebody with what is known in the psychological community as multiple personality disorder,
right,
or more currently these days they call it DID, dissociative identity disorder.
Right.
Anyway, we have seen some people healed of that, and their stories are always involved and tragic, and these people are hardly able to conduct a normal life much of the time. But I'll just say this, it's an astounding thing, and you can hardly do it with dry eyes, to watch somebody who has had multiple personalities be reintegrated into one integrated human being who can then go forward in life and function well.
Now, you have seen this.
I've seen it.
Recently, or when was this?
Well, the thing that prompted me to mention this was a case that I prayed for in Germany in October. But people come to me from time to time with it. I'm selective about the cases I get involved with, because people who have this, really what they need more than anything is someone to walk with them in their journey to wholeness reliably and consistently. And because I'm always in motion, going from here to there, many times those people, they certainly aren't going to travel with me. So it would be very sporadic for me to be ministering to them.
Right.
But there are those ones who come, and it just seems like it's the divine moment to do it. And there have been a few that I've taken on as cases, and I've worked with them in the more recent times. But in the past, I used to do quite a bit more of this. My wife and I did it together.
And what happens, in other words, this is not only spiritual. There's like a medical issue, right? In other words, you're saying that something traumatic happens in people's lives, and then almost the way we build a callus or something around something dangerous to protect ourselves from it, the same thing happens. Our psyche builds something around something, or this is not utterly inexplicable. It's just that our psyches are so complex that it's not easy to explain it. But you're saying it's things like that, and you have to kind of unravel that and bring healing to that in the same way that you would have to, excise a cyst,
Yeah.
It's like, except the cyst is a psychic cyst.
That's
I mean,
correct.
it's just fascinating to me that Freud, at least with all his mess ups, gave us a vocabulary of the psyche and enabled us to begin thinking about this stuff, in almost physical terms, so we can sort of spatially understand it.
That's right.
But I mean, the fact that you've seen this stuff, gosh.
Yeah, no, and if I weren't traveling, maybe I would do more of it. But again, when you start dealing in some of these things, there are some people that aren't all that happy that you're doing it, and so you can encounter opposition or
People in the
threats.
medical community.
Yeah, and sometimes threats. Yeah,
I don't get that. Threats by whom?
Take it for what I mean. I mean it literally. There have been.
But why would somebody do that? I don't get that.
Because there are some people who inflict damage on people knowingly and deliberately, and they don't like the fact that you're helping put people back together.
We're now talking about evil.
Yeah.
We're out of time. My friend Ken, thank you. The website, kingdomfireministries.org. Check it out.
Once upon a time, there was a radio show called The Eric Metaxas Show. It had an announcer named Todd, who was the handsomest announcer in the land. Eric was bitterly jealous of Todd's good looks, but there was nothing he could do. He just had to accept that cruel fate had made him as ugly as a toad. And now your host, warts and all, Eric Metaxas.
What? Hey, it's the Eric Metaxas Show, and I'm sitting here with my friend Ken Fish. Ken, welcome back.
We're live in New York.
In case people don't know who you are, they have to go to your website, kingdomfireministries.org. They can find out about you at kingdomfireministries.org. But you've been on this program many times, and we had some extra time, and I thought, let's continue our conversation. We're going to hear from Gary Wilkerson, I think, in the second part of the show. But right now, I want to talk to you about something you brought up the last time we were together, namely evil. Evil is not something we're typically comfortable discussing in this culture. We kind of make it sound spooky, but real evil. A lot of people say, I don't believe that there's such a thing as evil. I think there's bad people, but when we're talking about evil, we're talking about something especially dark. People of the Lie, a famous book by M. Scott Peck, which was really a game changer for me as I was considering Christianity 30 years ago. I read that book and I thought, here's a Harvard psychiatrist writing about his experiences with what he concludes is actual evil. And the final chapter of the book is an exorcism, basically. And I thought, if this guy believes in evil, maybe it's true, and then maybe there is a God, because if you're talking about evil on this level. So you've had experiences with it, and so I want to talk for the few minutes we have about that.
Well, in terms of the world I live in, most of my encounters with evil are with evil spirits.
Yeah.
And we drive them out, and we've discussed that before. So, we could revisit some of that, but that's the most common expression of it. But, there are people who are evil people. And we generally are discouraged, I would say, by our culture, media, education, from labeling certain people evil.
Now, I will give you pushback on that in the sense that I think sometimes we label people evil, like we say Hitler was evil, and we say this was evil. And I would say, well, wait a second. I don't know that a human being can be evil, because we're all created in the image of God. And only if you give yourself over totally to evil do you become evil. And I don't know that anybody is beyond redemption while they're still breathing, right? So I don't know. What do you mean when you say that?
Well, I would agree with everything you just said, But there's no question that some people do things, they commit acts, or they say things, or they engage in sometimes hidden activities,
Right.
which are themselves evil in their intention
Correct.
and their outcome.
For sure.
Yeah. So can people be redeemed while they're breathing? Yes, they can. Will they be redeemed? Well, that's a function of if they repent.
Right.
But there's no doubt when you look at, I mean, everybody knows it. It's almost become shop worn to say it, but the Holocaust.
Yeah.
But, that's not the only Holocaust that's happened. Before there was a Holocaust in Germany, there was a Holocaust in Armenia. I went to Armenia this last summer
Right.
on a trip and, was ministering in that country. And there was actually a bigger percentage of Armenians died in their Holocaust than as a percentage of the Jews. Now, there were more Jews killed in absolute numbers, but percentage-wise, the damage to the Armenian people was even
the
greater.
problem with killing millions of people, to quote Stalin, is it's a statistic, right?
Right.
So let's talk just more specifically. When I hear, and there are all these lurid programs on about whether it's Ted Bundy or the BTK killer or whatever it is, when I look at those shows and I see how these killers killed people and were obsessed with killing people and cannibalism and so on and so forth, I say, look, this is easy. This is demonic. This is satanic. There is no other explanation.
Right.
Good luck. You'll never find it. This is very specifically demonic. So we have evidence in the culture
Yes,
of that
we do.
kind of stuff,
Yeah.
and that to me is the prime evidence, because it makes absolutely no sense, by any other standards.
That's correct. I really have nothing to add to that. You're exactly correct. And then you can take that to a higher level, though, and you can talk about regimes which orchestrate this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, we live in a highly politicized time, and there's a great debate raging in our country around Donald Trump and the wall and this and that. And listen, none of that even comes close to what, say, happened in the Gulag under Stalin, or in China's equivalent thereof, where respectively about 100 million and 60 million people died. And it was deliberate, and it was premeditated, and it was intentional. I mean, I don't even know how you talk about that. That's half the population of America today, and all those people were just wiped out.
Well, we know that at the highest levels of the Nazi regime, there were people like Himmler, for example,
Yes.
who were thought to be particularly evil, right?
Yes.
That there was something about them, that there was a darkness that followed them, a frightening kind of darkness. And many of them were involved in the occult, and many of them
That's correct.
seemed to, and this is more than Hitler. I think of a lot of them as actually being more evil, quote unquote, than Hitler in a way when you know the details. Not that it matters, because you're comparing evil and evil, but some of them were specifically involved in occultic practices. It's
Correct.
like they were worshiping foreign gods, the gods of earth and soil, right? And I have read plausible accounts that they felt that killing the Jews would give them spiritual power.
Yes.
Which is as satanic as it gets. I mean, it's like, you watch Apocalypto or any of these movies where they have human sacrifices. You think, what is going on there? That they're butchering human beings.
That's correct.
To get some kind of occultic power, right? But I've heard about that. And I guess I wonder if there's a cognate with what's happening in America with killing the unborn. Like, what spiritually happens to a culture that does that? What are we buying with the blood of innocents?
Well, I think cultures that engage in any kind of systematic bloodshed, eventually they are called to account. As they say, the wheels of justice turn slowly, but they do turn.
Yeah.
And, God is not slow by his own reckoning, but in our minds, perhaps he is. But he notices everything. The eye of the Lord runs to and fro through the earth. And with that, he notes things that go on, and in the end, he will bring justice to bear on these unrighteous situations, because he is opposed to evil, and he is himself holy and pure.
I get that. I agree with that. I guess I'm fascinated with the idea that we tend not to talk about that. I mean, we talk about God's judgment, but you really wonder what is going on in the spirit realm.
Yep.
That
Well, the thing that's underneath all that, and I think this is where you're pointing at, is most of these kinds of groups, they thrive on the power of blood, and whether it's some kind of what appears to be a sick prank where cats and dogs are found slaughtered, or something happens on Halloween. Or maybe a little more sinister, some of the things that we periodically hear about that have popped up on Facebook or other social media sites where, people are talking about how they want to kill people and use their blood or drink their blood, or whatever it may be. There is something in that dark world of the demonic that craves blood. And there's kind of a hierarchy, if you will. I mean, I'm sure some of our readers think I must have just absolutely gone off the rails here. But at the lowest level, they'll take animal blood. But better than that is human blood, and even better than that is innocent human blood. So there is actually an ascending scale of what is preferred. And people who are into that sort of thing use blood to acquire and collect and use power, spiritual power.
Yeah. I mean, it's something I've heard about, I've read about. There's a reality there. Maybe not everybody's going to buy what we're saying, but it's worth at least being familiar with to understand how evil works. What is the coin of that realm?
Well, when you start talking with people who have been in that realm,
when we come back, let's talk about that. We're going to go to break, folks. Talking to Ken Fish. Stick around. Hey there, folks. Talking to Ken Fish. We're going to be back after this segment with more with Gary Wilkerson, the son of Dave Wilkerson, the late Dave Wilkerson, my former pastor, Dave Wilkerson, and the cousin of Todd Wilkerson. But listen anyway. Talking to you, Ken, we got about 10 minutes. We're talking about some dark stuff, but I said it's important to talk about. When we're talking about the satanic, there are people who traffic in this. There are people who do this, that they kill animals to gain spiritual power with dark forces. They kill people. There's a lot of horrible stuff that happens, and I think if you talk to cops, you can hear some stories. But
there was a mass murderer here in New York, probably, I'll say 20 years ago. I might be off a little bit, but around that time. And he was known as the Son of Sam.
That was 40 years ago, and I have corresponded with him.
Okay.
I'm not kidding. That was 40 years ago.
Is that right?
In fact, I take that back. 42 years ago. Summer of 77, the Summer of Sam.
Wow. Okay.
I remember it like it was yesterday. And, yeah, he was involved in satanic ritual stuff.
He actually has a website that you can go to, and he kind of gives his whole confession of here's what I got into and here's how I got there.
As I say, I've corresponded with him. He had a very dramatic conversion to Jesus.
Yeah.
He's not the same person. And, of course, many people don't believe that, but tough luck for them because it's true. He is a dramatically different person. So, yeah, he's written about that.
Right. And I think it's interesting, on his website, he actually says, I'm not writing this because I'm trying to get out of prison. What I did, and I deserve to pay for my crimes.
Yeah.
Which is clearly the language of somebody who has come to terms with what they've done.
Oh, he's totally repentant. The dude has never, in fact, he has refused parole. He doesn't want parole. He feels God called him to minister to other prisoners.
But I make that point because there would be people who would say, that's all just a sham.
Yeah.
And they would say he wasn't really doing what he says he was doing.
Right.
But the behavior itself tells you that there's been something authentic that's happened in him.
Well, so what does he say? In other words, when we talk about satanic cults, a lot of people say that's just fiction, that's crazy stuff. You know that it's not.
I know it's not because I periodically run into people who are coming out of those cults. Occasionally they're, warlocks or whatever they are, and other times they are people who have been victimized by those cults. It just depends on who it is. I don't make it my stock in trade to do that, but I guess when you do what I do from time to time, it finds you. So there you go.
And what do you say to somebody flirting with that kind of stuff? Because I think a lot of people think it's fun. It's kind of like when you play with a Ouija board. People think, oh, it's sort of fun and scary. They don't seem to understand what they're playing with.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we live in a funny time. You know, I think the America that I grew up in, I wasn't aware of anybody who was into that sort of stuff. And it was pretty well understood. Whatever Satan is, whatever evil is, you don't want to be over there. And so generally people just kind of stayed away from it. But there are people now who openly profess, you know, I am a Satanist, or I am involved in, you know, this kind of thing.
But they've been deluded into thinking that he's not Satan. In other words, they act like no, he's the good. It's like a different narrative, right?
Yeah,
like
right.
no, Lucifer is the liberating force from the patriarchal oppressive God,
right?
So they believe that. Also, you have a lot of this blurring where people talk about being Wiccans. And they say, well, it's not Satanism, it's this, it's that. So there is a continuum
Absolutely.
in that world.
Sure.
But there are still people that are somehow in love with darkness and evil.
That's right. And what they don't realize is it may initially seem attractive to them, but in the end, the powers that they're contacting will dominate them rather than them dominating those powers. In other words, it will get out of control.
The way I have put it, I think in one of my books I've written about it this way, that it's kind of like, let's say you owe a lot of money and you're in big trouble.
Yeah.
And somebody says, I know somebody who can lend you the money. And it's a loan shark, it's the mafia, but they give you what you need. And you say, thank you. And you take the money and you go, and now you're free. And then you realize, no, I'm going to now be under the thumb of the one who gave me the solution. They
correct.
are going to be worse than what I had going on before. So when somebody says, I can solve, like let's say somebody says, I can heal your kid is sick. And you say, you can heal my kid, how? And they go, well, it's, never mind how. And let's say it's the powers of darkness that heal your kid. Do you want to sell your soul for eternity? Do you want to be under the thumb of something satanic? You better be careful where you get your help from. That's my
right.
point. And
Exactly.
I think that there are people who say, like, I don't care where it comes from. It's spirituality. It's all good. And we're here to say, no, it is not all good. In fact, that part of it which is not good, which is not Jesus, is satanic. And maybe it's overtly satanic, but maybe it's just kind of masquerading as nature worship or whatever it is. But you're playing with really scary stuff. And I always want to say that to warn people, because you've seen this.
Yeah, I have. And I think the ancients had a pretty good grasp on the fact that there were these spirits out there that were about. We're on some sort of a boundary condition right now between what used to be called the view of modernity or post-Enlightenment culture or the scientific paradigm. People put different names on it. And I know those are not all used interchangeably, but I'm just trying to make it so our listeners and viewers can access what I'm talking about.
Right.
And this newer one that is emerging in the postmodern society, where people have a much more open worldview, and people are starting to reacquaint themselves with spirituality.
Right.
Whereas in the 60s and 70s and 50s, maybe they didn't, because it wasn't intellectually defensible, and you were mocked for it.
Yeah.
Now people are in this place, but over here now in the new world that we're coming into, it's like anything goes. And what we're really saying is you need to be discriminating about what it is that you're dabbling with, because there is good spirituality and there's bad spirituality as defined. And from time to time, that bad spirituality will show its face, and people can, try to perfume the pig, so to speak, but there's no way you can make evil be good when we're talking about the kinds of behaviors we've just been describing.
I mean, look, I've with our friend Matt Bennett.
Yep.
We were ministering to a friend who got deep into yoga. People say, "What's wrong with yoga?" Let me tell you, I saw evil spirits delivered. This woman was delivered from evil spirits having to do with worshiping entities in the yoga world.
Right.
If you had said that to me 2 days earlier, I was like, that's not a big deal. It's like some stretching, and this person's not into it deeply, so I wouldn't, come on. It was freaky.
Yep.
And I thought to myself, there are tons of people opening themselves up spiritually to all kinds of stuff. They don't have any clarity on could it be dangerous. They're convinced that this is just good. Is this good? It's spiritual. It's good for me. It's like green tea. It's good for me.
Yep.
But it's not. It's really scary. And part of what I want to do in the program is just to educate people that if it ain't Jesus, I would be really, 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 really careful, because I know too many stories of people saying, "Oh, we just played with a Ouija board," or "we just." It's like you have no idea. I mean, The Exorcist opens up with, "How did that girl get demonized? You know, for messing around with a Ouija board?" This stuff happens, and maybe it didn't happen to you, but it happens a lot.
We could sit here and do a whole show on exactly these things. You know, occultic objects and Ouija boards and all that stuff. I mean, I'm not saying we're going to, and we don't have time to do it now. But there's plenty to say in this area.
Yeah, well, I would like to say it in a future show. We can say it, but you are on the record as saying that all that stuff is scary.
Oh yeah, it's very dangerous, very dangerous.
It's
and it's dangerous not only in the now, it's dangerous in the future, because we actually do face after death our Maker, whether we know it or not, whether we believe it or not. It's going to happen, and for those that have aligned themselves with that other side. It says that God prepared hell, the lake of fire, for the devil and his angels. Well, that's what it was prepared for, but those who align with the devil and his angels suffer a similar fate.
I would like to think that people should, just to be logical, just to be fair, they should be scared of hell.
They should be.
This doesn't mean you live your life
in fear
of hell.
Yeah.
You should live your life loving God.
Right.
But to pretend that turning your back on the God of love doesn't have consequences. I mean, I wish it didn't. I mean,
I agree.
But it strikes me that God has created a reality in the natural and in the supernatural where there are consequences. And I would just say to people, since we're going to go to a break here and we're done with you for today, I just want to say, people, at least take this seriously, because we're talking about important stuff. Take your life and all these things a little seriously so that you don't blow it off, because we know enough to say it might be worth doing that. My friend Ken Fish, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
KingdomFireMinistries.org. KingdomFireMinistries.org. When we come back, we continue the conversation with Gary Wilkerson. Stick around. It's the Eric Metaxas Show.